first of all, thank you for being everybody here. This is the International HR Talks. This is a new, brand new kind of webinar. We are running since January, twice a month. And we bring very famous and outstanding disruptive people in HR to these talks to tell us what is going on a global level in HR. And today we have here Sophie Theen. She is very appreciated from me. Thank you for being here, Sophie. She joins us from UK, and she was one of our speakers at the, I think it was the 4th International HR Conference in Torre Telefonica in Barcelona. No, it was in 2017, 5 years ago. My God, yeah? Time is running. Okay, Sophie is a very disruptive HR person and startup person, and she will talk today about how to be disruptive in conferences, in virtual conferences, to make them disruptive and productive. This is very important as we are now in a hybrid working world, and I think this will go on like that. Although people are going back to office, we will have a lot of hybrid and virtual conferences. So thank you, Sophie, for sharing your experience, and please present yourself first. Thank you, Sophie.
No problem. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm Sophie. I am currently a startup advisor as well as a people advisor for a couple of companies. In the past, I spent about 10 years working, started off in recruitment first, and then went into doing HR. And in my very last role, I was the chief people officer for a startup company called Boom, which I'm still there right now. But at the same time, I also do some of these workshops, similarly to what we are going to be talking about today with other companies as well. Most of the companies I work with are in the tech industry, and they are based mostly in Australia, US, as well as in Europe. So if everybody, obviously, I will welcome everybody to ask any questions in the meantime. If not, we can do a Q&A at the end of it, because I want to make sure that everybody has key action points to take away after today's session, something you can implement back into your workforce as well. And we can carry on.
Thank you, Sophie. Maybe, Eva, can you put Sophie on a first plane, on a first image?
Of course.
Yeah.
Done. Get done.
Okay, Sophie. Okay, go on. Thank you.
Cool. So I'm just going to share my screen. And starting now, obviously I can see everybody on the side. So hi and welcome everybody. Today, what I really thought when Sylvia approached me and when we were talking about what are some of the very important things that we need to know about at this current landscape is the underrated skills for a distributed workforce. Of course, there has been many discussions around whether or not, typically a traditional manager is still able or effectively manage a distributed workforce, or people actually know how to become effective and work in a distributed way. So today, I really want to highlight a couple of the underrated skills that I have believed and I've also found really, really important when you're building out teams, building out businesses to make it really sustainable, because distributed workforce is not for everyone, but there's definitely a way where we can bring it together to make it effective for each and every person that is part of it. So starting off, I would like to, maybe I want to make a bit of adjustments. Okay, so starting off, why do some distributed teams fail? We've talked about this, and I'm sure, the current landscape right now, we've talked about, many people are talking about why some hybrid working teams are failing. Why do people are not willing to go back into the offices when the companies want them to go into the offices? So there's this contentious conflict at the moment, is simply because people don't really understand how to make the distributed teams work. And so therefore, from a general point of view, we tend to emphasize on why they fail. And because of that, we have now seen people moving on from companies to companies for as long as they fit their lifestyle. Now, principally, when you look at, you can call it remote working, you can call it hybrid working, as well as you can call it digital nomadic working. In the company that I'm currently working at in Boom, we are fully nomadic. And what it actually means is no different from a hybrid or a remote working workforce. So you would have the question, why do we call ourselves digital nomads then? It's simply because it comes down to principally what you want to create as a culture and what you believe is right for the company. So starting off, teams fail simply because they don't have the defined principle. For example, if a company is saying, we now want people to come back into the offices, we tend to not ask the question, why? Without a purpose, it makes it very difficult for people to readjust their living after post-pandemic to then go back into the offices. Immediately, they will feel, is it because we're now losing autonomy? Because we tend to focus on the negative when there is a change management. And so what we really want to try and emphasize today is it starts with the purpose. It starts with the why. When you're managing your own team, say, for example, and you have a distributed work team, you do want to start asking yourself, or if not the team, why do we need this to be distributed? And can we make our team successful? And that is the start of actually coming up with the right patterns, creating the right habits, as well as the right best practices to then make sure your team is successful. So that's a little bit about generally why teams fail, because they fail to understand the purpose or redefine their purpose. Let me make sure. Okay. Now, another thing also is we tend to think that freedom and productivity equals efficiency. It really is not. Freedom is easily seen as autonomy. Freedom is easily seen as trust, and freedom is also easily seen as honesty. So a lot of these things are compared by freedom, where people feel, if I am one person, an individual, not being in the office, I have lost freedom. Because you feel like you're sitting at the desk, or sometimes people say you feel like you're being chained at the desk and forced to perform your best work sitting in the office. As soon as we associate it with something negative and fail to see it as a way of creating autonomy within the team and an environment in the company, we tend to forget that the beauty of freedom means, again, it's creating honest environment, creating trust relationships within the team, as well as creating highly objective autonomy within the team. Then we come down to productivity. Another thing about the problem with productivity is we think if someone sits in the office, then they are highly productive because they are physically there for an X amount of hours. But when you're at home, which, for example, someone like myself, I start my day off early. I take a break between the 10 to 10:30 moment where I actually go around the block for a quick walk with my dog. It breaks up my day, and then I come back to the desk. I do my work, and then at the end, I log off at 6 o'clock, but then I also come back online at about 11, just right before I go to bed to check my emails to prepare my schedule for the next day. For me, I find myself highly productive when I'm working in a remote setting. So it really comes down to when a team is being set up for success in a work environment, such as a distributed environment, we need to first answer the question, what does productivity means to me? So this is a common misperception of why teams has failed. And finally, efficiency does not equate to being able to deliver your work on Friday so that you start the week purposefully and clearly. Efficiency is a combination of enjoyment and knowing that the deliverables are up to standard. So you may be able to delegate a task to your team where you want it to be highly efficient, but your understanding of efficiency may be very different between you and your manager or you and your team members. So understanding the purpose of efficiency when it comes to a quality perspective in the team is highly important when you start off the team. So that's a little bit about the principle of how you would be able to create a great and efficient as well as working distributed team. Now, moving on, we now know the principles of creating a team. How do we actually execute them instead? Starting off, we talked about the misperceptions of what the principle is. And it's really important to make sure that the people in your team are willing to go on this journey with you. So as a manager, if some of you are managers at the moment, as managers, you want to make sure that your team is fully aligned to the committed trajectory of your team. So it really comes down to, as a principal, you want your team to be highly autonomous. What does autonomy mean to you as a definition? For some, autonomy means being able to deliver the work at whatever time and whatever scale where there's no micromanagement. For some teams, for example, autonomy means you can work as much as you want and however you want in whatever parts of the world you want, including time zones, but I would like some visibility on trackable deliverables. That is autonomy. So it really comes down to, as a manager, you want to be able to define the committed principles when you set up the team. Now, once we've done all the good stuff, we now need to make sure that our team have the right skills to actually go on this journey. Remember, we were talking about earlier that a traditional manager in the past may be very different from a manager right now that manages a distributed workforce. So we're really talking about soft skills that has been highly underrated simply because we used to be in the office. So what are the top soft skills that has been highly underrated is, for example, time management. We want to be able to ask our team these questions. What are the tools you are currently using to manage and track time deliverables? Number two, how do we embrace the diverse team and time zones? This is a very, very important factor that actually cripples some distributed teams. For example, I have a team member who actually sits in Australia. So as you know, there's a huge time difference in two different hemispheres, and therefore it is night and day. In our team, what we do is, coming back to the tools question, we use Slack to communicate with everybody within the team. However, when we embrace different time zones and a diverse team, we also have an offline channel in Slack, which technically means how we use this is, as a team, we've agreed as part of our commitment when we set up the team that any meetings that happen during the day in the UK is being recapped as a 3-line sentence as a summary in this offline channel. So therefore, when someone's sitting in Australia, when they wake up in the morning, the first thing they do is they check that offline channel so that they do not feel that they need to be working late at night just so that they have enough information and enough context of the company. So the first thing they do is they wake up in the morning, they check this offline channel, they go through a couple of the main highlights, and they can start their day. So this is how you want to be able to manage distributed team. And that's why time management tend to be one of those really highly underrated skills. It's because we take time management for granted. Sometimes also another example would be the tech team tends to think that because they're highly technical, they're very good in time management. That is not wrong. It is not a misperception. They are also highly organized in the task level. But what it technically also means is they are also the first people to go into burnout very quickly. This is why time management becomes an underrated skill. Just because you have your list of tasks noted out and listed very clearly does not necessarily mean you're managing or tracking the time being used to deliver them carefully. So this is something that we definitely need to start thinking about when we want to run highly successful distributed teams. And finally, how do you organize projects and deliverables? Being able to not see each other in a room usually creates miscommunication. And being able to organize yourself very well, visibly and clearly using whatever tools that you are using will often minimize the impact of miscommunication. You will hear this a lot. In a distributed environment, I'm sure many speakers and many great experts in hybrid working will tell you over communication is the current pattern. We used to take communication for granted. We used to think that I'm running stand-ups, I'm running weekly meetings, I'm running quarterly meetings as a company, depending on the size that you are in. And so therefore, I just take it for granted that every time we get together, people understand everything that needs to happen, as well as the job that they need to do. So making sure that you're able to organize projects and deliverables in a very clear way, but also very consistent way, is very important for time management. So that's one of the first underrated skills. Secondly, we talked about communication. It feels like for most managers right now, it is a checkbox exercise. There's a misunderstanding that having great communication means doing more one-to-ones with people. But what if one-to-ones are highly ineffective? What if the one-to-ones are just for chit-chat and not really giving each other tangible feedback? That's another problem. So let's really talk about communication and how to make communication work for a distributed workforce. First things first, what are the channels you currently use to communicate? Are they wide and are they transparent? Companies use Slack, companies use Teams, companies use different kind of tools. However, the first question to ask is, are there channels where people can ask questions? Is there a platform or a certain specific forum where people feel like there is a certain way of psychological safety for asking questions without feeling guilty? Are there channels where people can share the passion and their working habits that can be replaced by not being in front of each other face to face? So these are some of the things that are really important to think about. Secondly, do you have a habit of documentation? Now, you may think, why does documentation fall under communication? Well, actually, documentation is a medium for effective communication. We want to be able to document things that are important, because when you speak to each other and when you have a distributed and diverse workforce, you may use slightly different languages based on your upbringing. You may use slightly different wording to represent yourself. However, when it is being translated to a document, it makes it easier for you to create consistency in speaking to each other. So therefore, a habit of documentation, be it a small company or a large company, should always be something that you really take it as a critical importance in your team. Do you have a virtual but cohesive communication method? And what are your inclusive languages? Inclusive languages are now becoming more and more important in a diverse workforce. We're not just talking about people sitting scattered around the world, but we're also talking about inclusive languages where you can make people feel safe being in the team. For example, there may be different languages are being translated into, say, a professional language. Say, for example, your company uses a professional language, which is English. There may be different languages that are being translated into English, but does not really actually deliver the most efficient way of communicating to people. So as a team, and if you do have a diverse team, I would highly recommend that you come up with some sort of safety language that feels really inclusive for people. Another example would be the way you communicate in a diverse workforce. As an Australian myself, we are known to be very blunt, which technically means my sentences when I give tasks, celebration, as well as feedback, they are very short form. Instead of starting with, how is your day? How's the weather? I would like you to do better in this XYZ. On the other hand, because of my upbringing, I tend to go straight in and go, hi, Sylvia, just want to let you know that what you've delivered is not up to standard, but happy to discuss further in our one-to-one. Is my language inclusive enough for someone who probably do not understand and did not come from my similar upbringing? Is that an effective way of communicating to a team that may interpret it slightly differently? Or if I am a new manager coming into the team for the first day and I've given feedback this way, would my team feel fearful that they may have insecurity in their job? So it's really about understanding whether or not you can commit yourself to an inclusive language. Mm-hmm. And finally, what is your communication cadence? And are they consistent, rather sporadic? Communication is not something to take lightly. And that's why, again, it comes back to the theme of underrated skills. When you have communication, even if you have great communication within your team, one of the things that always needs to happen is consistency. When you do not have a planned or structured communication cadence, you tend to go into a loop of miscommunication, misinformation, and misleading expectations. So it's always important to understand what your cadence looks like. Okay, so that's the second underrated skill. We now go on to the third, which is obviously one of the most important, but at the same time, the most obvious: collaboration. We talk about, oh, you know what? Some people are really lucky. Some teams are really lucky because, say, pre-pandemic, they have always been kind of working well together. They were in the same office, and they have already foundationally built a really good fundamental personal relationship. Therefore, moving into a hybrid or remote working setup becomes quite easy. But at the same time, we tend to forget that collaboration is equally just important wherever you sit, because that is the new landscape of how we work already. So how can we get ahead of that schedule? Which is, first things first, ask yourself, are the tools that we are using in the team right now fully accessible globally? Right? We know that we have many tools out there, but what if there are tools that are actually not accessible globally? I'll give you an example. I do have teams that I currently manage that are distributed out in the Ukraine. And when the Ukraine war happened, they were immediately switched off Jira. As a tech team without Jira as a tool, they did not know how to deliver their work. So it's really important to start thinking about these things before it even happens. Not necessarily about another war breaking out, but it's equally important to always remember to think about, when I'm organizing my team, are my tools accessible? Then, are your company goals or team roadmaps, even KPIs and OKRs, fully transparent and easy to understand for all levels? Having it fully transparent, sometimes you might think, hey, this is quite easy. I will use Asana. I will put all my OKRs in a company. I will run a town hall. And so therefore, 200 people, 2,000 people will fully understand the roadmap and the OKRs. But hold on a minute. People have different understanding levels as well as comprehension levels. If we do not take time to take through and actually do a due diligence to understand whether or not people truly understood the goals and the roadmap, then you are guaranteed to find inefficiency in your team, as well as the lower quality of output that is being delivered. So it's very important to make sure that first, it needs to be fully transparent so that there's a reference point to go back into. And then to ensure that you do not take the shortcut to ensure people do understand it at all levels. Cool. So these are some of the underrated skills, underrated soft skills that we tend to think, well, we'll take it for granted. Everybody who is a manager would know all three of these skills, or everybody who's operated in a company long enough would have a specialty in these skills. Now, having these skills are really good and very beneficial. You almost think that you already know how to run a great team. But sometimes the thing that actually limits us is whether or not we have the right mindset. You can implement a great tool that has been created from a different company purposely for remote working. But if you do not have a remote working mindset to start with as a philosophy, how would you be able to fully embrace this tool and make it work for you? Therefore, we call it building the right mindset. Building a right mindset is creating a positive culture around trust and transparency. When we used to be in the office, when we used to have face-to-face time, trust and transparency is at the very bottom of a priority when it comes to a culture. We tend to think about, do we have the budget to do socials to get the team together? Do we have budget for learning and development so that we can send more people into courses for them to become better managers and better individuals? Do we have a great workspace or an office where we have, health and safety checked off? We have the right tools for people. We have collaboration rooms, and are some of those things easy to obtain? But when you immediately take away all these physical, tangible elements, that tend to make up your full day of your job, you now start to think, what kind of culture can I foster? And what is the most challenging culture to foster? And that comes down to creating a culture of trust and transparency. Trust and transparency comes down to creating clear and honest feedback loop, for example. Do you have town halls that have Q&As that people feel safe to ask questions? Do you have projects that you also celebrate failures as well as successes? Do you then also have goals that are achievable and descriptive? This goes back to our point earlier. Are the goals easily attainable, but at the same time also equally understandable for all levels? Is this a company that has a culture in showcasing a company performance openly? Of course, leadership level tend to have some information that is quite difficult to share it to the rest of the company, given the fact that we tend to operate in a fear mode. We tend to ask ourselves questions that if I were to openly tell the company that we're not doing so well in sales because it's summer period and sales have already backtracked, will this create fear in an already uncertain landscape and environment right now in the market? Will we lose talent if the talent thinks that, because there's a talent war, but then if the talent thinks that the company is not doing so well, will we lose talent? Then without these talent, how do we then deliver the products that we have promised our client to then move the growth stage to the next stage? So it's really important to ask yourself this question, especially as leaders in the company. Do we and can we enable a company performance metric or conversation openly? So these are some of the things and some examples that I would hopefully be helpful for you to start off in bite sizes and then eventually evolve them into something more grandeur. And this all in all is because you want to create a positive culture of trust and transparency. Now, another thing about the mindset then, let's not encourage social isolation. When I talk about social isolation, if you think about in real life matter, it's about 10 people going to dinner together, and they are all seated because they are forced to sit at the table together. That's static. As soon as after dinner, we now start to go for drinks, people may break off into smaller groups to go and have their drinks in a certain place, have drinks in a different place, even if it's still in the same setting, right? And that's very natural for human behavior. And that also happens in a nomadic culture or a remote culture. It is exactly the same as how you would visualize when you go out with your friends as the 10 people, and eventually when you end the night, it's probably just the 4 of you after. Again, it's a very natural and organic evolvement of how our social standings are. And so therefore, even in this remote working environment, we should not encourage social isolation. Number one, how can we avoid that? Let's make an effort to create, say, a well-being agenda. Now, when I talk about a well-being agenda, it isn't necessarily about talking about, let's create more meditation classes. Let's create more virtual yoga classes. I'm not very flexible myself, so therefore I tend to not join yoga classes, be it virtual or physical. But what I really mean about creating a well-being agenda is, number one, it is such a hot topic that touches every part of the person's lives, regardless the life stage they are at. And so when you create a common theme as an agenda and a social standing in the calendar, people tend to find more motivation to join, because this is now no longer immediately or directly work related. So it's really important to try and think about, if it's not a well-being agenda, what other things that you feel in your company can put people together regardless the position they do, the role they do, and wherever they sit in the world. Secondly, create engagement opportunities, for example, such as company or team retreats, culture or charity days, do good days in our company, for example, are days that are not necessarily cultural or charitable, but do good days are people who actually, you know what, they want to go out to support some companies in different things. It could be there is a non-profit company that they are actually dedicating their time to help them run a couple of tech workshops. And that are included in our Do Good days as well. And as they feel more motivated to be able to have the freedom from the company to enable them to give back to the community, they generally become more productive workers as well. And you will then be able to create more passion and more tribes within the company. Company retreats are definitely not overrated depending on how you do it, but team retreats, however, on the other hand, are something that people tend to overlook. If a company does company retreats, they think, you know what? It's okay. I don't need to really catch up with the other people because in about 6 months' time, everybody comes together and we have a company retreat. But the team technically means that they won't be able to actually get some bonding time together in the next 6 months. So it's equally important to think about on a micro scale, what else would work that can be replicated. I highly recommend team retreats because it's also, for me personally, in my teams, we do this every 3 months. And the company does a company retreat every 6 months. When it comes to our team retreat, we actually use a full day of shutting down our laptops, shutting our Slack, shutting our emails, and we actually do workshops to resolve problems, to do mini hackathons together, and then always come back much fresher, ready to start the next quarter. So that's a couple of examples that hopefully might be helpful for your teams. Coming back to the hackathons, hackathons are basically a great way as a group for the company to solve a common problem. I love running hackathons, be it small size or large sizes. In the last 2 months, we've ran a company hackathon that comprised of 250 people. You might think, well, how do you run a hackathon, 250 people? Well, technically, we've got a major problem to solve. And guess what was that problem to solve in this distributed environment? The question I put out there for the hackathon was, how do we make remote working work for us? And it's incredible. We've broken 250 people down to 20 teams, and every team had an incredible creative solution. Because why? It directly impacts their life. And this was a great way to cross-pollinate skills and strengths together to solve a common problem. Now, finally, also create and encourage open tribes. I love the word tribes because it's now becoming more and more important because people tend to get connected, not just the work that they're doing because they have a deliverable together and they are forced to be in a group. They are now becoming more open and have freedom to choose their own tribes. So think about implementing something as simple as this and as low effort as this in your teams or in your company right now, such as you can have a diversity, equality, and inclusion group to talk about the common challenges in the market, if not your own company. We have a team that is purposely just for hiking because people tend to want to go on hikes and they want to share, great scenery photos that kind of brighten up your day a little bit. We have metaverse groups. We basically have groups that just keeps popping up because we gave our employees their own autonomy to create tribes that they believe they can find 2 or more people. So the second thing to talk about, obviously, just to wrap up, is please do not encourage social isolation because it is very natural to happen. And if you don't pay attention to it, you're technically encouraging it. So again, just to recap, we obviously need to make sure we harness the underrated skills. However, having the right mindset is the only way to enable learning these skills to be implementable into your teams. So don't be afraid of changes, of course. And as you are in those positions and as you have the passion to drive things forward for the better, I would highly encourage you to help your companies get better. That's it from me.
Thank you. A big applause, Sophie. Thank you very much. Okay, who wants to start? Who has got a question? We have got a CEO here. Bart, can you apply something in your company?
Yes, we can.
For example, yeah.
Well, we have been working in a hybrid situation for some time now after the the pandemic. And in some teams, there is clearly a lack of some points you mentioned before, so like communication, time management. And I think the first point is very important as well, to define what is the purpose of being of doing home office or presential in the office. Yeah. So yeah, I find it interesting what you're telling, actually. Thank you.
Sophie, you are an advisor for companies to work more remotely in a more productive way. I understand. Okay, I understand.
Yes, that's right. So when I do my workshops, this is exactly the type of workshop that I would do with the companies that we talk about ways of working.
But you don't speak any Spanish, Sophie.
No, unfortunately. Though the funny thing is my husband is actually Spanish, yet I have learned nothing from him.
Okay.
Okay, good. Carmen, have you got a question? You're an HR director. Maybe it was interesting for you.
Yeah, I would like to know how. Well, congratulations for your presentation. It has been very interesting. I would like to know how you work. In fact, you start with this presentation, but if I hire you, for instance, how do you implement it? How do you work the teams to implement it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So what I normally start off with, obviously, these are mindsets and soft skills. And soft skills are not something you need to teach or you can teach, but actually it needs to be implemented. So what I normally do is when I'm being asked to kind of, okay, we've got a team that's slightly dysfunctional, but they are highly distributed. How can we make ourselves more efficient? And I usually run a ways of working workshop. And a ways of working workshop is usually for a full day. And we start off with setting a desired outcome, which is what we believe our team is about. This is where you define your purpose, the principles, creating the guardrails, as well as the commitments. So some commitments, for example, will come off as we want our team to have better psychological safety. Now, this is a big word. What does it actually mean? It immediately tells me that this team is struggling to communicate with each other in a respectful way. And so it really comes down to starting off by defining your purpose for the team. What does distributed mean for us, and how can we make it work for us? Different people have different circumstances, and different people have different kind of life stages and personal life that they need to maintain. Okay, so setting up the boundaries and the commitments are very important at the very start. Then we go down to how do we solve these problems then, right? We talk about wanting psychological safety, right? Let's park this away and take 15 minutes to really talk about the context of why psychological safety isn't happening right now, and how we can bridge it. So and then at the end of the day, we have a action plan that usually comes down to creating one, better processes, better tools, commitments around how to respect each other. And one major thing that I've always found as a key pattern that comes out from these workshops is the ability to give each other feedback. I think we tend to take that for granted. We tend to think that, there's this saying where people feel, you're a lot more extroverted, therefore you can speak better. That's actually false understanding. And it doesn't matter what type of personality you actually are. The more important thing is, are you able to understand your own feedback style before you deliver your feedback? So I'll give you an example, right? Carmen, I would say I come to you, I'm your manager in the team, and I go, right, team, I think we need to establish some feedback style that works effectively for the team. I will start first. I'm a real-time feedback person, and I don't use a sandwich model. And what this means is I tend not to give you too positive to give you a negative. I go immediately and tell you a negative or it is a positive. And I'm also a real-time feedback person, which means I tend to give you feedback immediately. I do not wait for our one-to-ones. Yes, for a fact that I would obviously prepare for our one-to-ones, but I usually find it a lot more effective to give you real-time feedback. Then you are probably sitting in front of me going, Oh, I really appreciate your honesty. Well, do you know what? Actually, Sophie, while I appreciate your real-time feedback, for me personally, I feel like when I get real-time feedback, I don't have enough time to process it. And so therefore, it paralyzes me. It almost feels like if it's a real-time feedback that's negative, I don't see it as constructive. That's a great way of opening up honest communication in the team. Exactly one of the points that we have talked about. And so therefore, between you and I, we've now established that we need to find a middle ground for each other. And then at the end of that quick conversation, we would then establish, all right, Carmen, I think we've agreed that moving forward, I will give you real-time feedback when it is positive. When it comes to negative, let's use our one-to-one time to its best. And I will articulate, I will document, and I will give you enough context and examples to then deliver that constructive feedback to you. We walk away with agreement, and this is how we can work together. Not just as individuals, but when you expand this into the team, your entire team will then be able to establish the way they communicate and give each other feedback.
Great, thank you.
Sophie, in case of Bart, yes, he's leading a big company, yes? And he can't contract you because of language or budget or whatever. Who is responsible in his company to implement the rules for effective hybrid working?
That's a great question. So normally I would say someone who actually has an overview of most projects, because it comes from the habit of how to work together. So, we're talking about someone who's quite operational. Either it could be someone in your leadership team who is a COO, could be a good representation. I have also seen it work when the CEO themselves actually champion great working behaviors, because then it just kind of trickles down and everybody kind of understand that this is principally the company we want to create. And then also, if you do have someone, that is a little bit more general across with great communication skills, say, for example, like a chief of staff, ever so often, I work very closely with the chief of staff to create a great working environment. And so someone who is highly, highly skillful in communication is usually able to be the best person to be on point to run ways of working workshops.
And not HR?
HR, I think personally speaking, HR has too much bias because they want to serve all people. I think it's very important to get someone who is also highly operational, is because then you get to see how it impacts the business, not just from a people point of view. Because if you really think about it, say in my position, I want to sell to my CEO or my business leaders that we need to run a ways of working, which is probably going to take about 4 or 5 hours, which means it completely disrupts the company. I need to be able to give them a benefit. Productivity equals to cost of company, right? So someone who is highly operational is also a really good way, because then you're creating very robust processes that comes out as an action plan.
Okay. Before the pandemic, we had big problems struggling with meetings. Everybody was always in meetings. And if we said we started 12, everybody arrived at 12:15, yeah? And they ended later, yeah? And it was really not very well organized. And the hybrid working has improved our working. We are much more on time, and the meetings are shorter. And do you think companies need some ethics rules, how to behave in virtual meetings?
For sure. And it comes down to defining what the meetings are for, right? Does the meeting actually have a purpose? Or is the company prepared to use great habits in meetings? For example, a great meeting I would attend would be one that shaves off about 5 to 10 minutes off the end of the 60-minute meeting, which means it's scheduled for 45 minutes or if not 50 minutes, so that people have that time to jump from one to the other. Physically, when you're in the office, you require that anyway, right? So why wouldn't you do exactly the same and treat it the same way when it's virtual? So that's one of the first points I would make. Secondly is, we want people to be fully prepared and to be fully contributing to the meeting. So do not invite people who you do not believe is going to contribute for the sake of it. Therefore, you create meeting fatigue. People feel like they go into meeting fatigue. Why? Because 50% of their meetings they sit in, they have nothing to say, and they feel like it was a waste of their time. So can we define this better, where we don't need Sophie in that meeting. It's totally okay. We will do the meeting and then give her a 3-line quick recap so that she's visible of what is happening, but not necessarily need to waste another 45 minutes in a meeting that she probably will not say something. And I think it's about creating the boundaries and respect. Creating that respect of, Sophie, you're not invited is simply because we don't need you there, not because you're not important, but we don't believe you're going to add any value here. And as an individual, I would like to expect that. I would like to accept that statement as my peers respect my time. Therefore, they have made the decision not to add me into those meetings. And finally, the third point to make is to be very prepared with an agenda. Let's not make a meeting for the sake of it. Let's put an agenda and also then have a desired outcome. What are we aiming for?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any more questions? Aina?
Thanks, Sylvia.
Thank you, Sophie. Would you like to ask something, Aina?
I think Sylvia has a question.
Yes, I do.
Sorry.
Yeah, hi.
Sorry,
Yes, I see your hand.
Hi guys, hi Sylvia, hi Sophie. I'm actually the Chief People Officer for an advertising agency, and it's an international agency. So when you talk about an inclusive language, which is one of our biggest challenges, I am dealing with 28 different nationalities within the team. So I get that maybe Australians and Americans are very direct, Spaniards, Latin Americans are not. So that's a big challenge right there. But I'm also facing the fact that because it's a creative advertising agency with a big digital team, we've got full stacks speaking to art directors, just to give you an example. So basically, what are some of the tools, or what do you think are some of the key issues that we need to address to create that inclusive language? Because we're dealing with a lot of very different challenges right now.
Yeah, that's totally fine. I was previously working with a full Italian team, and there were 80 of them. And I remember first day rocking up, it was already feeling quite abrasive, because although I was just trying to be myself and I wanted to be really direct in terms of how to make things better, they have immediately found me quite abrasive. And so the ways of working workshop had really, really helped at a very early stage. So Sylvia, I totally hear the challenges that you're going through, but it does really come down to
the desperation that we're going through.
Yeah, desperation. You do need to find some commitment and actually create some sort of guardrails, because when it doesn't, and if you continue to let this fester, it will create a unnecessarily toxicity in the relationships. So the first things first is create a good narrative around the differences, right? We're talking about why some people are quite direct. Have an understanding that people are actually quite direct because, one, they don't have time for it. So take note that maybe they're starting to get a bit burnt out, not because they are bad people. Secondly, also create a narrative around the type of people you have. What are we here for, right? For the company, what are we working towards? And if you're able to establish a very similar pattern where you can create an environment where people are sitting in front of each other and they may be speaking completely different alien languages, but they're here for the same reasons. And that actually will slice through a lot of the misunderstandings and miscommunication. So if I'm sitting here and say, I'm quite direct, and Sylvia, you are a polar opposite of myself in communication styles. But if you and I are fully aware and have respect that you and I are here for the same reasons, you do cut through a lot of these miscommunication, which technically means when I come to you with a sentence that has no more than 10 words, let's put it this way, you would go, Sophie just wants to get things done. I get it. So surfacing more of these things, and I would highly recommend, if this is already happening in your company, open up feedback platforms, open up feedback conversations. When I say feedback platforms, I don't mean let's create more surveys for people to put their ideas in or put their feedback in. I am simply saying let's create small groups of chats. So let's put it this way, say you have, you have 50 people right now. I would highly recommend that you immediately go back to work and go, I want to run a feedback session. And you don't really need an expert in the room to run a feedback session. Actually, you just need an advocate and an enabler. So you run a feedback session of maybe 10 people. hopefully they are also cross-functional. So you get more out of that rather than just the same subset of people talking about the same thing. So maybe you handpick 5 full stack and 5 of the creative people, put them in the room and go, right, let's talk about feedback today. What's everybody's style? You obviously need to prepare yourself a little bit. What are the styles? Just to get the conversation started. Okay, does everybody understand their style? Right, now I would like a dashboard where I put, everybody please put your feedback in now that we've all understand our styles as a starting point to just get the conversation going. Then you go, I want to run a start, stop, continue. Can we all put our feedback down? You will tend to start to notice that throughout this session, people are putting the same comment in a different way and a different language. That's when you see these are commonalities. And as that person who facilitates that, that session at the same time, I would then say, go and pick out these patterns and go, right, there are 10 people in the room. It sounds like we only have one problem. Why do we all believe that this is the same problem we're all going through, and how can we resolve it? Ever so often, you'll find that getting things off their chest in a multivariate environment is far more effective than just going into pinpointing you're a bad speaker, you're a bad communicator, and isolate that problem. It is always a team problem.
Definitely. Okay. No, that's great, Sophie. Thanks for that feedback. I'm taking a lot of notes.
No problem. I mean, I would love to keep in touch if you still want a couple of pointers, but I do recommend that if you're able to run some of these smaller group, I wouldn't call them workshops even, right? You don't want to insinuate them. So maybe just say, right, I want to run a small feedback session because I really think we need it. Let's go. Keep it to a very nice time scale, 45 minutes, nothing more. Give them kind of like something visual for them to put down. You can use Miro as a chart. You can use different kind of tools on a whiteboard as well, and then get them talking. As the facilitator in that room, you will see that the pattern comes up very, very often. And this is why I also pointed out there are clearly lots of skills to make a distributed workforce work, but it comes down to the 3 main underrated skills. It's just simply communication and getting the right mindset.
Great. Perfect. Thanks.
Cool.
Maybe I would like to add, in my own company, I established, when the pandemic began, a short meeting every morning, half an hour. So we don't only talk about the projects. First, I ask them, how are you? How do you feel? What's happening with your family, father, mother, or whatever. And they love it. They love it to talk about their personal stuff. And 10 minutes, personal things, 15 minutes, and 15 minutes about projects. It's really great.
That's a great way as well to start the day.
Yeah, of course. It's for me the most important meeting of all the day. Yeah, I need it every morning to talk to the team. How are you? And so it's really great. It's very collaborative. How can I help you? What is your project? Yes, and it's very collaborative. It's fantastic. We celebrate every birthday, of course. Yeah, we celebrate when a project has been finished. When we get a project, everybody comes with a cup of coffee or with a cup of champagne, and we celebrate things, situations. Yeah. And we introduced, because I saw that people were very exhausted, so much time on the screen, and we introduced nearly 2 years ago the 4 days labor week with full payment. And so this is really great. Yeah, not always easy, but we are working in a trustful environment. People are senior, and so we can arrange very well. Yeah. Any more questions to Sophie?
No? Well, I am on LinkedIn. I would love to connect with everybody and obviously keep the questions coming. I always feel like the more questions I get, the more times I resolve these questions, the better it is for everybody, because I always believe that, you know, when you pass on the same solutions around the circle, people tend to kind of realize that, you know, you're not alone and these are all solvable problems. And at the same time, we're not saving lives. So it shouldn't be that difficult.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Sophie, for one question. Bob?
No, just saying it was very interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Thank you. Really, Sophie, thank you. You will see the summary in LinkedIn, no, Eva? And yes, let's stay in touch, please,
Yeah.
Sophie. Thank you so much.
Of course, of course.
you.
Well, take care,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for
Bye bye.
coming.
Take care.
Bye.